Hey everyone, so I'm going to do a series of videos on the endocrine system, and this one is going to begin with a real focus on hormones specifically, how they find their target cells, how they enter their target cells, and how it is that hormones go about exerting their effects on target cells to begin with. So I've highlighted some of the key learning objectives here. So what are some of the main processes that are controlled by the endocrine system? So you want to think big picture here. I'd like you to know the main categories of hormones. I'm going to classify them as polar and nonpolar, and I'm going to layer in the amino acid hormones so you can categorize them there, and consider how the nature of the hormone is going to influence not only how that hormone enters the cell, but also how it's going to be transported in the blood. We'll look at the factors that determine if a target cell is activated. And last of all, we'll look at different mechanisms that are responsible for a gland releasing a hormone in the first place. Think about the two major systems in the body that are responsible for communicating body-wide. You've got the nervous system, which works predominantly through action potentials, the release of neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters acting on muscle cells, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, as well as on glands. With the nervous system, you see that we are looking at short-term effects. So the impact is going to be quick in nature and short-lived. So think about the fight or flight response. Somebody pulls out in front of you and you have epinephrine released and your heart is immediately racing, your palms are sweaty, etc. So these are really quick responses. With the endocrine system, it's going to control activities of slower duration, so think metabolism, growth, development, those sorts of activities. Let's put a formal definition on hormones. So long-distance chemical messengers transported in the bloodstream that are going to elicit effects in a target cell after a period of a few seconds to several days. And so as we get deeper into the endocrine system, I really want us to be thinking more and more about what the target cells are of particular hormones. Not every hormone will have the same target cells. And some hormones, like thyroid hormone, are going to have target cells at just about every cell in your body since they're responsible for metabolism. So in thinking about hormones, I'm big on tapping into prior knowledge. So I'd love for you to pause the video and just think about how many endocrine glands or hormones you can name off the top of your head. And once you've done that, take a look and see if you can come up with some of the key processes that are controlled by hormones overall. So pause the video. Some of the hormones that came to mind first were probably things like estrogen and testosterone. And it's really common to think of those reproductive hormones first, but we're going to see in the coming lectures that just plays a small piece in our overall endocrine system and all of the effects that it exerts on the body. To highlight some of the key functions of hormones, these are some of the key ones. So reproduction, right? Growth and development. So growth hormone certainly is a nice example there, but testosterone also plays into growth as well. Electrolyte balance. So we're going to see that calcium, as just one example, is going to be regulated by hormones, specifically parathyroid hormone. Water balance. So staying hydrated. Antidiuretic hormone is a nice example here. Metabolism. So thyroid hormones. Sleep. Those are just to name some of the big functions of the body. So really trying to set those slow, long-term control systems in contrast with those of the nervous system. Next, I want to look at how hormones know which cells to bind to. What are the mechanisms involved for a hormone being able to bind to a cell? So it is the case. So hormones, they're always circulating through our bloodstream with the endocrine system, right? So here's a cell producing hormones. The cell will be part of a gland. The hormones shown in blue here travel through your bloodstream, and they will either bind externally to receptors on the cell surface and then exert their effects on the target cell as a consequence, or they're going to go right through the cell membrane and bind to receptors on the inside of the cell. And so thinking way back to 111 and a little bit of 201, I'm hoping that one of the things that came to mind when I talked about either externally binding to receptors or binding to receptors on the inside surface was hopefully this phospholipid bilayer, right? So you've got these polar heads and you have these non-polar tails, and that plays a huge role in how a particular hormone is going to enter the cell. So let me add some more layers onto this. So mechanisms of hormone entry. So if a hormone is lipid soluble, the key hormones that are going to fall under lipid soluble are going to be your oids. So you have your steroid hormones and your thyroid hormones. So what they're going to be able to do is they can go right through that cell membrane. They're not repelled by the phospholipid bilayer. So they can go right through the membrane of that cell and bind to receptors on the inside of the cell and act a little bit more quickly in the cell as a consequence. So in contrast, water-soluble hormones, those that are polar in nature, they are going to be required to bind to receptor protein on the outside surface of the cell. After they've done so, they can then work potentially through second messenger system to become integrated into the cell and then impact the cell and its action. Examples of water-soluble hormones, epinephrine or adrenaline acts this way, norepinephrine, all of your peptide hormones act this way. I wanted to point out too that your thyroid hormones are actually amino acid based, but they are going to be non-polar in nature. So I wanted to make that point clear because I know that thyroid hormones are classified as amino acid and I didn't want that to be confusing. Something else to keep in mind with your lipid-soluble hormones is that these are derived from cholesterol in our diet. I was just looking at how it is that hormones of different classes are able to enter a cell, but the piece that we haven't yet looked at is how the polarity of a hormone influences how it travels through the bloodstream. And there's a big difference here. So if you have a hydrophobic hormone, we'll start there. So these are the kinds that are going to be non-polar in nature. They can go directly through our target cell membrane and they can bind to receptors inside the cell. But if you scale back and follow these blue triangles, you're going to see that many of these hydrophobic hormones need to be bound to a transport protein in the bloodstream. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. Our blood is predominantly plasma, and plasma is predominantly made of water. And so if you have a lipid-soluble substance, it would naturally repel from a water-soluble substance. And so by having these transport proteins in our bloodstream, it allows these hormones to more easily move through our blood. In contrast, while it takes more effort for the hydrophilic hormones to gain entry into the cell, right, they have to bind to these external receptors. As they travel through the bloodstream, here are these free hormones. They don't need to bind to any receptors as they move. You may be asking yourself, okay, well, how is it that you have some of these hydrophobic hormones that are bound to a protein and some of them that are freely floating through the blood? And you may have encountered this through diagnostic testing potentially. So testosterone is one hormone that comes to mind. So it's going to be lipid soluble in nature. And if you get a blood test done to test your testosterone, you may very well get a report that looks at free levels of free testosterone as well as bound testosterone. So if you look at this, what you're seeing here, this is supposed to represent a blood vessel, and you're seeing free testosterone that's bound to one of the plasma proteins, so albumin. And here you have testosterone that's bound to one of its key globulin proteins, SHBG. So this stands for sex hormone binding globulin. It's a protein that has the greatest affinity for testosterone. So you see a larger percentage of T being bound to this particular protein. Another one that comes to mind is TBG, or thyroxine binding globulin. And that's one that binds to T3 and T4. Again, thyroid hormones, it's one of the oids. So you know that it's going to be non-polar or lipid soluble. And so as a consequence, it's going to be more dependent on binding proteins in the blood for transport. We've looked at the polarity of a hormone and how that influences not only how a hormone gains entry into the cell, but also how it's transported into the bloodstream. Now I want to look next at what factors are going to influence if a target cell is going to be activated by the hormone that's released. And so there are 4 key factors that I'd like you to be aware of that are going to impact how much a target cell or whether a target cell is going to be able to receive messages from the hormone. It's a nice way to think about that. So first of all, high specificity for a target cell. So this is very much lock and key mechanism. So does the shape of a hormone that's released, you've got a little rectangle based hormone here, it's going to have to find a receptor that has a little rectangular binding site. And obviously things get a lot more advanced than that when you look at these complex quaternary and tertiary structures of proteins. But nevertheless, there does have to be a high degree of specificity. And if you consider that these hormones are traveling through our blood, this is incredibly important, right? If you have growth hormone or epinephrine that's released into your bloodstream, you are going to want to make sure that that hormone binds specifically to the target cells that it should, and not to any random cell in the body. Blood levels of the hormone will certainly influence the extent or the degree to which a target cell will respond to it. If you have more testosterone in the blood, cells are going to be more responsive to it. If you have more or less growth hormone in the blood, then you won't see as much of an effect from that growth hormone. The affinity is going to be a factor here. If you were to explain affinity to a young child, I often like to use the word or the adjective stickiness. How much a hormone is going to be drawn to that cell. The higher the affinity, the more likely it is that a target cell will receive a message coming from a hormone coming past. And then lastly, the number of receptors. So this target cell is shown with a single receptor here. If it had multiple receptors and if there was enough hormone coming by, then it's going to get more messages coming from that hormone. Conversely, if there were fewer receptors, it's not going to receive those messages as well. And so one of the key points that I want to emphasize here is that the number of receptors is something that is incredibly dynamic. It's constantly changing. And so we can either upregulate the number of receptors or we can downregulate the number of receptors. A great example here occurs with the number of oxytocin receptors that you see in the myometrium of the uterus in the 3rd trimester. So as a woman gets closer and closer to delivery, her uterus is actually going to prepare for the arrival of large quantities of oxytocin. And so by upregulating the number of receptors for that oxytocin in that smooth muscle of the body, the woman is better able to prepare for delivery. Downregulation would be just the opposite. So here you're going to end up with fewer receptors. This could be a consequence of having high hormone levels. So if you have chronically high hormone levels, the cells may respond by saying, hey, I'm getting too much of an impact from this particular hormone, and I'm going to protect myself, or I'm going to maintain homeostasis by coding for fewer receptors on my cell surface. And so what this essentially does is desensitizes the target cells. And so a really common clinical condition that responds in just this way is type 2 diabetes. So let me walk you through what this looks like in very basic terms. I'm definitely oversimplifying here. One of the reasons that an individual may develop type 2 diabetes is because of chronic high levels of carbohydrates or sugar in the diet. So when you have high blood glucose, the key hormone that responds to that and lowers your blood glucose is insulin. So what you're seeing here, so the glucose is shown in red, insulin is shown in blue. And so the reason that insulin lowers your blood sugar level is insulin binds to cells and allows those cells to take in the glucose. And so if over time the body is constantly having to produce a lot of insulin, then what these cells will do, let's imagine these are hepatocytes in the liver. What these cells will do is they will start, the DNA in the cell will start coding for fewer of these very specific proteins, fewer of these insulin receptors. And so we go from a scene that looks like this to a scene that looks like this. And what this picture is trying to show is insulin receptors that have been downregulated, that are no longer active. And so now you have this glucose, a lot more of it in the bloodstream, and you don't have as many binding sites that are available for insulin. So insulin is doing its best to bring glucose into the cell, but it's not able to do that as efficiently as it was before because it doesn't have as many receptors to do so. So this is a great example of down regulation. The cell has become insulin resistant. The ways in which we regulate endocrines is through negative feedback mechanisms. It's almost always through negative feedback mechanisms. And so essentially what you're going to see, so think back to 201 and homeostasis. So as levels of a particular hormone rise, it causes those target organs to initiate a feedback that then inhibits more hormone release. So let's look at a picture here. I think we need a graphic on this one. So let's take something, right? I've talked about testosterone a number of times. So, and I'm choosing that one off the bat, or estrogen, because it's ones that we do have more familiarity with. So testosterone coming from the testes or estrogen coming from the ovaries, right? So as we have more and more, as levels of testosterone rise above a particular set point, so go outside of our homeostatic range, that physiological range that's ideal for a person's body, what happens is you get this negative feedback. So that's what the negative signs are. You get the negative feedback upstream on the glands that are ultimately responsible for releasing testosterone. I'll show this loop or this chain of events in another video, but essentially the testes know to secrete the testosterone because these two hormones coming from the pituitary tell it to do so. And the pituitary knows to secrete these two hormones because the hypothalamus tells it to do so through the role of this. This is gonadotropin releasing hormone. But again, the main takeaway point for the time being is that when testosterone levels go above the set point, again, you have negative feedback. The testosterone circulating in the bloodstream will suppress the pituitary from releasing these hormones. And it also can suppress the hypothalamus from releasing these hormones. So this is a pattern that we see hold with the adrenal glands, with almost all of the hormones that the pituitary glands release. And so it's very much a pattern that we'll see play out again in this class. The last point that I want to cover in this initial video is looking at what would cause an endocrine gland to release a hormone to begin with. And so I'm kind of working backwards here. I've talked a lot about hormones, the nature of those hormones, and how that influences target cells. But now I want to take a step back and look at why that hormone will be released in the first place. You can have a humoral stimulus, a neural stimulus, or a hormonal stimulus. So when we're talking about a humoral stimulus, you want to think about humors, Humors, of the body. So humors of the body refers to fluids of the body. And so what you're really seeing here is that a hormone release is going to be caused by altered levels of a certain substance in the blood. This could be electrolytes or ions in the blood. That's run with a few examples there just to begin with. So calcium is something that we have to regulate within a really narrow range. And so as calcium levels in our blood drop, we are going to see that is the trigger. That is the signal that triggers our parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. And we'll look later at how PTH then works to increase blood calcium. We just also saw another example of a humoral stimulus, and that was looking at the example with diabetes. And so if you have blood glucose, so again, we're looking at a a quantity in the blood. And if glucose in the blood gets too high or too low, then our pancreas is going to respond by releasing either insulin or glucagon. With a neural stimulus, that really the best example and the main one that I'd like you to know is what's illustrated here. So when we study the adrenal gland, we're going to see that it's divided into the adrenal cortex, which is very glandular in nature, and also the adrenal medulla. And the medulla is very neural in nature. And the two hormones that you're going to see released from the medulla are going to be adrenaline or epinephrine and noradrenaline. So you can see where those words come from. The name, the hormone name adrenaline comes from adrenal. And so epinephrine would need to be released in a fight or flight response. And so this is a nice example where you see the nervous system feeding into the endocrine system or stimulating it. Last up is the hormonal stimulus. This is arguably the most complex of the three because it really involves those chain events that I was just describing in looking at that example of testosterone. And so here it's the case that a hormone that's released causes another gland to release its hormone. And so when you're looking at mechanisms in this way, we refer to that hormone as being a tropic hormone when it can cause the release of another hormone. What you're seeing here is the anterior pituitary gland is going to release hormones that stimulate the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, and the gonads. So let's run with one that we haven't seen yet. So the anterior pituitary is going to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And as you might imagine, TSH is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. And as a consequence, the thyroid glands will then release thyroid hormones. So predominantly T3 and T4. With the adrenal cortex, you're going to see the anterior pituitary secreting ACTH, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone. I know it's a mouthful, but it's really telling you what it does. And then as a result, the adrenal cortex can then release things like cortisol or aldosterone. So as we go through deeper lectures on the endocrine system, think about what mechanism it is that we are seeing with a particular hormone and the target effects. So hopefully that's useful. Thank you, guys.